We're joined by Marwa Fatafta, Public Policy Manager for the MENA region for Access Now. Marwa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You were here at 360 speaking a bit about the misallocation of content moderation resources, the vast divide between resources directed by platforms in moderating English language content versus content in the rest of the world. Could you speak a bit about that challenge and issue?
Sure. I mean, whenever you bring up content moderation, everybody has a complaint. And in the Arabic-speaking world, we tend to have the world-to-world problems. We have, on the one hand, over-enforcement of content moderation policies that govern terrorist speech or incitement to violence. And as a result of that, a lot of political speech gets censored and removed on the platforms. And on the other hand, things like hate speech directed at women and gender minorities, disinformation, state-sanctioned troll armies, those unfortunately are left unmoderated on the platforms. And the question, why is this the case? There are a number of factors, one of which, what you mentioned, is how platforms allocate and prioritize certain regions over others. So for instance, if you look at platforms' response to the rising or escalations of violence in Israel-Palestine and fast forward their reaction to the current situation in Ukraine, we see a complete disparity in response, clear disparity in how they prioritize the safety of certain users over others. And unfortunately, that's been the situation for many users in places like Syria, Yemen, Egypt, and beyond.
Mm-hmm. So with many languages, there tends to be a lack of individuals who are proficient in the language, a lack of training sets for companies to train their automated systems on. That's not necessarily the case with Arabic, because there are large training sets, but they originate very much with the legacy of the global war on terror. Could you speak a bit about how the war on terror still intersects with content moderation policy?
That's a very interesting question. Well, first of all, let's look at what platforms define as terrorism or incitement to violence. There are a set of interesting policies that criminalize, so to speak, or blacklist particular pieces of content or words that are part of a community's political lexicon. I'll give you an example. In Palestine, there's a word that is part of our everyday life that Facebook considers to be a praise of terrorism when it's mentioned in conjunction with certain individuals. Do users know about this policy? No. If you go to their community standards, you actually don't know what they criminalize or blacklist in accordance to their own terms of services. The banned individuals on those platforms are also tend to comply with the US terrorist lists or designated groups, which also speaks to how platforms follow certain geopolitical lines. Mm-hmm. Of course, platforms always argue that they have a legal, they're legally obliged to ban certain individuals or groups because of the US material law, which is not. Certain lawyers argue that this is not necessarily the case when when you have a user describing or talking about these groups, it does not constitute material support. So there is, of course, division about how you interpret that law and how it applies to people's speech around the world. The frustrating part of all of this is that we have been raising these issues to the platforms repeatedly, especially last year during the events of Sheikh Jarrah and the major takedown and digital repression that we've seen by social media companies. Again, talking about how they respond to conflicts or situations of emergency, where instead of prioritizing user safety and freedom of expression, we see major takedown of content, and particularly documentation of human rights abuses. And as a result of that, or despite of the warnings of civil society and trying to raise the grievance of users, the moment there's an escalation of violence, it's like having a nightmare on loop. It's the same situation all over again. Content is taken down, journalists are being censored, accounts are being blocked, certain features of the platforms is also being disabled, like you're not being able to live stream from the site, or you're not able to share certain content. And the answer we get from companies is that we're sorry, it's a technical glitch.
Mm-hmm. Access Now joined with dozens of other rights organizations in early April in issuing an open letter which expressed sympathy and solidarity with the people of Ukraine, but which also observed that some of the decisions that platforms have made in the Russo-Ukrainian war, that those decisions should be applied to other conflicts as well, and a potential re-examination of other conflicts. Could you speak a bit more about this and what this policy and revisitation might look like?
Sure. I mean, platforms say that all of their users are equal, but in reality, some users are more equal than others. And as a result of that, we saw how companies rushed to take executive decisions in a very swift and timely manner to respond to the egregious war of Russia on Ukraine, which is really important. And we think that they have set a precedent to how they should react to other content, to other contexts and to other conflicts where, as I mentioned in the case of Palestine or the case of Syria, the same reaction or the measures have not been rolled out. And people continue to be censored and routinely booted off the platforms. So the message of the letter and the message to platforms today is that they really need to prioritize and ensure that all of their policies apply equally to all of their users, and particularly to users who come from marginalized communities or from historically oppressed groups who do not necessarily have access to the same resources or access to mainstream media. And so I think the reaction to Ukraine, to a certain extent, is good, but we could also argue that some of the measures that they have taken have not necessarily consulted local groups and have not taken into account what would they mean in reality, especially for specific carve-outs that have been made in regards to incitement to violence or hate speech. So I wouldn't want to paint the picture or paint their reaction to the Ukraine situation as all rosy. But still, that kind of swift reaction is really important and lacking in other contexts. And so, hence the call of paying attention to other places as well.
Well, thank you. And one last question.
Yeah.
You've graciously joined us at 360 OS today. But what's your sense of the event or any big takeaways?
It's amazing. I mean, first of all, this is my first event after 2 years of the pandemic, and I guess this is probably the experience of many of us here. But it's been really amazing to connect with people that you've seen only on Zoom, like yourself, and to meet with experts who are passionate about tackling some of the most pressing questions of our time. So I'm really happy to be here, and I hope you're also enjoying the conference yourself.
I have, and we've been very happy to host you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marwa.
Thank you.